Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. Welcome to the 2012 Deakin Graduate School of Business Brookes Oration and Brookes Medals presentation ceremony. My name's Ross Chapman and I'm the head of the Deakin Graduate School of Business, your host for tonight's event. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Mr. Andrew Brookes, who is standing in for Mr. Roger Brookes tonight, and members of the Brookes family, our distinguished orator, Mr. Allan Asher, Chair, Foundation for Effective Markets and Governance at the Australian National University, Deakin University's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Jane Den Hollander, and Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Deakin's Faculty of Business and Law, Professor Gail MacDonald, Deakin staff, students and alumni, and also members of the Melbourne community. Welcome. I'd like to begin by recognising and paying respect to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered this evening. We pay our respects to them and acknowledge their stewardship of this land and its natural environment. The Brookes Oration was established in 2006 and endowed by Mr. Roger Brookes in honour of his late father, Sir Wilfred Deakin Brookes. Sir Wilfred had a long and distinguished career in business and the corporate world, working with a number of companies, including Western Mining Corporation and North Broken Hill Holdings. He was decorated as a World War II veteran and contributed significantly to his community life through his work with the Institute of Public Affairs, the Liberal Party and the Edward Wilson Trust. Sir Wilfred was the grandson of Alfred Deakin, the second Prime Minister of Australia, after whom Deakin University is named. Among his many community roles, Sir Wilfred continued his family's association with the university as chairman of the Deakin University Foundation. I believe Sir Wilfred would be pleased to have this oration presented in his honour by the Graduate School of Business. Consistent with the mission of Deakin University, our goal as a leading graduate business school is to be a catalyst for positive change in business, governance and practice. We aim to achieve this through understanding and researching the international trends in business and business education, being responsive to the needs of business and public sector communities, and providing high quality, flexible learning programs in postgraduate business education. Deakin University was one of the first universities in Australia to offer the MBA and has been producing MBA graduates for over 30 years. In fact, just last year we had our 30th anniversary. Building on this extensive experience, the Deakin Graduate School of Business currently provides a range of flexible and innovative programs in postgraduate business education, including our flagship MBA program. Our staff members are involved in leading-edge business research in partnership with industry, government and community. This engagement generates passionate learning facilitators in our staff and informed and motivated graduates from our MBA programs. Later tonight, we'll be recognising two such excellent graduates as our Brookes Medal winners for 2011. We do that because they're the best graduates in the graduating class of 2011. So don't get confused when I talk about 2011 graduates. It's our 2012 oration, but that's from our last year's graduating class. The patron of the Brookes Oration, Mr. Roger Brookes, has a distinguished background in business, including a successful accounting career, working with companies such as Colonial Gas Holdings and Alcoa of Australia. He retired in 1985 and has since pursued his many interests and associations. I would particularly like to thank him for his continuing support of this event. Unfortunately, Roger is unwell tonight. I'm assured it's nothing serious. However, tonight, Roger will be represented by Mr. Andrew Brookes. The Brookes Oration is presented each year by the Deakin Graduate School of Business to encourage thoughtful debate about the contribution of corporate Australia to the global community. This year's speaker is certain to continue the proud tradition set by previous presenters of the oration, including Mr. Hugh Morgan, Dr. Steve Bracks, and Mr. Simon McKeon. I would now like to invite Professor Gail MacDonald, Pro Vice-Chancellor of the Deakin Faculty of Business and Law, to formally introduce our 2012 Brookes Oration speaker.
Thank you, Ross. Well, it gives me considerable pleasure to introduce our 2011 Brookes Orator, Mr. Allan Asher. By way of background, Mr. Asher, from 1974 to 1984, was a senior executive with the Australian Consumers Association. In 1984, he was appointed to the role of Director of Corporate Affairs with the Overseas Telecommunications Commission. From 1988 to 2000, Mr. Asher was Deputy Chairperson of the ACCC. He spent 10 years in the UK as Director of Campaigns and Communications with the Consumers Association and as a board member of the Office of Fair Trading. From 2003 to 2008, Mr. Asher was the CEO of the UK consumer watchdog organisation Energy Watch, which protected consumer rights in a deregulated energy market. Returning to Australia in 2009, Allan Asher was CEO of the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, where his main focus was to review the inadequate customer care practices by Australian telecommunication companies. From 2010 to 2011, Allan Asher was the Commonwealth Ombudsman, during which time he campaigned strongly for social justice and for fair and just treatment of asylum seekers in immigration detention. Mr. Asher currently chairs the Foundation for Effective Markets and Governance, which is hosted by the Regulatory Institution Network at the School of Regulation, Justice and Diplomacy at the Australian National University. He has been an outspoken consumer advocate and campaigner for several years throughout his career. He's campaigned for fair and effective markets. He's a barrister and a solicitor of the High Court of Australia. Could you please join me in welcoming our 2011 Brookes Orator, Mr. Allan Asher. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I can't think of a more appropriate oration than one that's built upon the foundations given in a speech by Sir Wilfrid Brookes 33 years ago. And as I read and reread his remarks, I was amazed at how salient they are for business, policymakers, and especially for MBA graduates of today. And the first thing I'd say from that was that in giving this oration 33 years ago, it was not in this series, of course, but Sir Wilfrid noted that for the MBA programs, he felt the most suitable people, the people who would most benefit from an MBA, would be those who were going into small business. He then wisely noted, but of course, given time constraints, they're some of the least likely to go into that form of study or any form of study at all. And that's a theme that I'd like to develop a bit more. And that is the problems faced by smaller enterprises in dealing with the complexity of the marketplace and, in fact, the absence of fairness in the marketplace. But there was more that Sir Wilfrid said that I think to be highly relevant to what I'm about to say. And I'd just like to quote a little bit from the paper that he gave 33 years ago. He was speaking of the challenges of business and the increasing complexity. And he said that there were increasingly potent variables that were brought to bear in the task of being a senior manager. He went on to say that more than ever, business managers must be aware of changes in public attitudes towards business. Important segments of the public are raising questions that have their roots in other issues. Whether the free enterprise system is the best way to provide a satisfactory standard of living for Australians. What trade-offs are there for society? No longer is corporate success measured by the creation of economic value and profit alone. Effective management today requires anticipating a full range of social, economic, political and technological changes in the community. Along with computerisation, inflation, exchange rates, international competition and changing standards of product quality, he went on to speak about the obligations, in his view, of companies to deal with critical issues such as the environment, such as labour issues, such as the interests of consumers and the wider issues in the community more broadly. I was most struck that he then went on to give a list of the characteristics which we all know now to be the agenda of corporate or social responsibility movement, where he spoke of stakeholder engagement and good corporate citizenship. I must say that for a business leader 30 years ago, that was outstandingly prescient and something that I find to be greatly to be admired. Well, I want to talk just a little bit about my credentials to speak to you. You've heard where my working life has been, but I started my working career with a firm of chartered accountants in Sydney, and at the time I'd commenced studies in a commerce accounting degree. And that firm of chartered accountants, this was in 1968, the height of, I suppose, what was a speculative minerals and mining boom, where there wasn't the production that went along with it, but there was scandal after scandal as Brins, Harbourside, Bounty, Westmoreland. I can list a dozen companies which floated, took tens of millions from investors, many of them unsophisticated investors drawn in by this then minerals boom, Poseidon and others. Many of them, or pretty well all of them, soon lost their money, and quite a few of the promoters fled the country with bags of cash. I was, as a young person just starting out in the workforce, quite shocked by that, and in fact it drove me out of that business altogether, and I instead switched to study law, at which time I was working at Choice magazine. I worked there for 10 years or so, and came to see in a very sharp way the way in which fairness played out in the economy. Firstly, my key interest at the time in relation to ordinary consumers, where people were the victims of some very unscrupulous marketing practices. The corporation Waltons, for example, who had door-to-door sales programs that tended to prey on some of society's most vulnerable people. There were a little code system that they used. They would write on the gatepost of a house sometimes the letters HDK. And what that meant was that if a salesperson went to the door to collect the small amount of money weekly as they used to, and they saw this HDK on the front gate, that told them that the husband doesn't know, and that they were to pretend to be lost or something like that, and that the practice of keeping people perpetually in debt and many of the things that went with that were quite formative influences for me. In the marketplace, I started working there in 1974, before the operation of the Trade Practices Act, which has, in my view, absolutely transformed the Australian economy. And one section alone, used to be called Section 52 when it was the Trade Practices Act, that prohibition against deceptive conduct. And I'd ask those of you who have any recollection of commerce from that day, the Australian marketplace was not one in which superior quality products offered at better price or innovation or service won customers. Instead, the marketplace was so characterised by deception, by price-fixing agreements, market-sharing arrangements and the like, that it's no wonder our economy in those days was bumping along the bottom of OECD averages. Another formative experience. So my working life has essentially been dedicated to this issue of trying to foster fair behaviour in the marketplace. And a lot of that has been in relation to individual households or consumers at that level, but a lot of it also has been in relation to a group in the community who are largely overlooked in real policy solution terms, and that is micro and small businesses. We all know that they make up such a large part of our economy, and we also know that they receive an extraordinary amount of attention in parliamentary inquiries of all sorts, but they don't receive a lot of attention when it comes to changing some of the fundamental problems that they face of a disparity of market power in dealing with other businesses. And it's that issue, a journey to fairness in commerce, that I'd like to share with you and encourage what I hope will be a conversation not only here, that one might go on outside, and as a charge to any here who are recent graduates or students still, a charge that this might be some issue that you factor in to the values that you apply in your own business. And that there was 23 years ago quite a seminal High Court decision in Australia that rather set the scene for what has happened since. And that decision was a High Court decision in the Queensland wire case. And I won't go into the details of that at all, but let me just tell you what the Chief Justice had to say about competition. He said, "Competition, by its very nature, is deliberate and ruthless. Competitors jockey for sales, the more effective competitors injuring the less effective competitors by taking away sales. Competitors almost always try to injure one another in this way. This sort of competition has never been taught, and in fact, it's the inevitable consequence of the competition the law is designed to promote." And another judge spoke about how the law had nothing to do with morality, but instead about economic efficiency. It's a pity, in my view, that those judges hadn't had the opportunity of reading Sir Wilfrid's address to understand that wider societal aspect about that. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some of the broader notions of justice, and then some more specific applications of that in the Australian context, to look particularly at aspects of concerns by small businesses, and as a case study there, the current debates that we see between suppliers to supermarkets and some of the issues around that. And then I'd like to give a few suggestions as to how things might be moved on in a positive way. Well, on this issue of fairness, it's my contention that anyone with children, or perhaps anybody who can remember being a child, will instinctively realise that notions of fairness are innate in humans, or if not innate, they arise at a very, very early age, and that the most common response to any infant, even from I'd say 2.5 years old or so, when asked to do something they don't want to do, or told of a decision that they don't like, will exclaim that that's unfair. Now, it might be that in objective terms we say that's not a very good signal of anything at all, but that is a characteristic which actually does continue into later life. And the fact that it starts off in that way is no indication of it not being a valid emotional reaction. In fact, more recently, there was a column in the Dilbert cartoon series where the author said that fairness is a concept invented so dumb people could participate in arguments. And the a commentator on a recent blog said about that really it's a criticism of the assumption that fairness, being a subjective and relativist concept, lies in the way of fact-based political and economic debate, and that the assumption that fairness actually isn't part of the natural universe. And I guess the blogger agrees with that, but he would also say that it's no more artificial and no more a construct than notions such as the invisible hand or many other things that we see as guiding principles in our thought and logic. Then on another blog that I read just a few weeks ago, there'd been a panel program on the ABC looking at what's commonly now described as the myth of the fair go. And in this program, speaker after speaker spoke about how, well, it was never true and that it's a waste of time talking about those things. And the blogger wrote, have none of the panel considered the psychological impact on behaviour that comes from telling a group that they are fair, reasonable, trustworthy and collaborative? I'd say, obviously, a teacher. It's well documented that this sort of internal signalling, when it comes from a trusted source, profoundly influences behaviour. Tell a classroom that a certain ethnicity has lower grades on average before a test, and that group's grades will suffer accordingly, and goes on. I believe that in the Australian context, there is really what I might call a vestigial remembrance of where we came from, and that whether you were a first fleeter as a convict or a first fleeter as a free settler, Australians in the early days had a very difficult relationship with the government, a government which, as we know now, was often quite arbitrary, quite violent, and often quite corrupt, and that there grew up in the early part of our colony a sense of that difference and a sense of the want of fairness in that, which I believe was what gave rise to, whether you regard it to be a myth or not, at least that narrative about fairness. And so we've had in our law over many years now a move to do something about that, starting in 1974 when Senator Lionel Murphy, the then Attorney General, introduced the Trade Practices Act into the Commonwealth Parliament. And in doing so, he said there were two goals for this law. The first, to control monopolies and restrictive trade practices, and the second, to get rid of unfair business practices. That was 1974. It took really until about 2010 for that gap to be closed, because there were a prohibition on on misleading and deceptive conduct. But since then, the law has struggled through many attempts to deal with this broader issue of fairness, and that it's only in the last couple of years, with the introduction of the National Australian Consumer Law, that we now have unfair contract terms laws in Australia, which seek to proscribe dealings of that sort, but only with consumers, only for goods and services of a kind ordinarily acquired by a household. And so many business contracts, small franchisee arrangements and things of that sort just aren't covered by these arrangements, and so don't get that benefit. And I've been a long time advocate of the desirability of having a prohibition on unfair business conduct, and that for many years the standard response was that it's too vague and uncertain, or you could put it in that Dilbert conversation framework by saying it's a construct. But there again, so was the prohibition on misleading and deceptive conduct, and so are so many aspects of our law. They are constructed by parliaments to determine classes of acceptable behaviour, or to define those classes of behaviour that aren't acceptable. And that in the Australian context, we now have unfair contract terms laws, but not actually a prohibition on unfair conduct. They operate in a way that strikes down contract terms which would cause a significant imbalance in the parties' rights and obligations arising under the contract in such a way that they're not reasonably necessary for the protection of the legitimate interests of the person making the contract. We've followed somewhat there the European Commission, which has had a directive on that for some 15 years. In the United States, the Federal Trade Commission has had such a standard in its mandate since 1913 when it was formed, and in Japan, the Fair Trading Commission there operates a similar standard. And yet, in the country that has this strong ethos of fairness and a fair go, we've found it very, very difficult, and we've been very reluctant to bring these into laws. But nonetheless, in relation to ordinary consumers, these protections now substantially exist, or that plus another raft of laws on unconscionable conduct. And here is another area where especially micro and small businesses manage to lose out rather badly. Because in the Trade Practices Act now, for many, many years, there have been provisions about unconscionable conduct. That is, conduct which in good conscience shouldn't be allowed. It's developed from the old equity system, and it's been used for some centuries as a standard for state intervention in private affairs to prevent the exploitation of individuals. Well, under the current law, these provisions still operate, but again, they're not available to small and micro businesses. And just a few weeks ago, here in Melbourne, a Supreme Court judge in the case of Director of Consumer Affairs against Scully ruled that the standard should return again to a high and almost impossible one, where you have to find some significant moral wrongdoing on the part of the trader before any relief will be given. And that this means that in relation to so many of those contracts with small businesses and large suppliers and dealing with the government itself, they're just not going to ever be able to get near that standard. And that's going to prove to be a great barrier to any remedies to them. Australia now does have unfair contract terms laws. We have laws on unconscionable conduct. What we don't have is a simple prohibition on unfair conduct. And I've been an advocate, again, for a long time for a very simple change to what was the Trade Practices Act and now the Australian Consumer Law, to change the phrasing from a corporation shall not, in trade or commerce, engage in conduct that is misleading or deceptive to conduct which is misleading and unfair. And that it's my view that within a relatively small time, the courts would come to provide checklists of what constitutes actionable unfairness, that compliance systems would be changed, and that a whole raft of measures which currently exist that are very expensive and extensive could be replaced. So the question is, what are the key problems facing small businesses? In the case of supermarkets, they're only an example. I could be talking about franchise arrangements. I could be talking about shopping centre tenants. I could be talking about franchisees of car companies or oil companies, or those on small to medium farms dealing with large agribusiness producers. But typically, there's a profound imbalance in bargaining power. Typically, there's an absence of information. Typically, there's an absence of MBAs working for them. And that often means that they frequently act to their own disadvantage. Just going back to those notions of fairness in society, the New Scientist magazine, a US magazine that brings us up to date on, in a pop sort of a way, recent developments in science and psychology, has been writing a series of articles about the now well-known science of behavioural economics. And they point out that it's fairly clear that human behaviour in the marketplace does rest on some notions or attention to concepts of fairness. And in particular, there are various empirical studies that show that humans, in the main, will, in commerce, act against their own interests if a bargain appears to be unfair. The classic example of this is where if you're offered by somebody a sum of money, somebody has $50, and that they say that they've found it, but you need both to agree on splitting that up if you're allowed to keep it. And time and again, experiments show that even though the third party would benefit from any sum at all, they will not settle and would rather have nothing than to have a very trivial portion of that money. And that across many markets, these standards are applied in the way that laws and negotiations are carried out. Now, there's a big debate in this issue too about the notions of fairness and its linkages to issues like equality. And that I think that can be a bit of a misleading route to go down, because if you are speaking of equality, we live in a most unequal and increasingly unequal society. At least that's what the protesters of the Occupy movement seem to have demonstrated. Whether or not you agree with their methods, very few of us would. But nonetheless, the issue of the 1% and that income distribution and many things of that sort, which are being increasingly skewed, shows us that it's not an equal society. And in any event, would you be talking about equality of opportunity or equality of outcomes? A better approach, in my view, is to talk about issues of equity, and this one about where the use of power or influence by one party can overwhelm the will and capacity to make a sound decision by another. And so in the supermarket context, both in Australia and the United Kingdom, there's been a lot of evidence that some practices that include the adding up each month of all of the stock losses by some stores and then sending a bill to the supplier, the changing overnight of terms, often the demanding at very short notice of changes to price or contributions to marketing arrangements. Many of the transactions I'm speaking about here aren't ones about which even a diligent supplier could have any knowledge, and that in the United Kingdom, after a 2-year investigation, the Competition Commission concluded that markets in that country, where there are 5 supermarkets who dominate the sector, we only have 2, that the relationships with many of their suppliers has become so bad that not only is it damaging to suppliers, but that the whole marketplace has been damaged, and that issues of innovation in that market and access to a broad range of supplies is under threat. And so in the UK Parliament just a few weeks ago, the first reading debate was held for the establishment of what's called a supermarket adjudicator. And that's a body that will investigate some of these claims and be able to make findings where there is clearly a misuse of that bargaining power. Not in the sense that competition law speaks about it, because, as I read to you before from that Queensland Wire decision, the courts are not all that interested in the protection of an individual competitor. The court went on in that occasion to say the purpose of the law is the protection of the process of competition, not the protection of individual competitors. At a certain point, of course, the disappearance of more and more individual competitors must have an impact on the whole process of competition. And so it is that in the UK, a statutory organisation will be formed that'll be able to investigate some of these egregious practices. Let me hasten to say that I see a real tension that one does not want to remove from the marketplace that vigorous competition. After all, consumer welfare is most assured where there is vigorous competition between fair and informed players in the marketplace, and that to take steps which would damage that would undo many of the welfare gains that our market system has brought about. And I believe that if you think back to those quotes that I gave from Sir Wilfrid, you'll see that he was struggling also with the way in which the society deals with these issues, and I believe that there is a case for intervention that doesn't damage the competitive processes, but does provide more protection for micro and small businesses. Well, what might that look like? In the case of the UK, it's going to be about trying to expose some of the worst of these dealings and to proscribe them, to provide a voice. In Australia, just last week, the federal government announced the appointment of a small business commissioner. 4 of our states now have small business commissioners as well, some of whom have roles in alternative dispute resolution, including mediation and conciliation, and that some even in arbitration, as ways of trying to bring these matters forward. It's not an easy issue to deal with, and the problems are quite intractable. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't conclude our law reform debate by saying now that the laws are adequate for consumers. We should also realise that in respect of their dealings with big businesses, financial institutions and others, small and micro businesses are themselves in that same position. We intervene on behalf of ordinary consumers because of that disparity in bargaining power and access to advice. In my view, we should consider doing that also in relation to small businesses and micro businesses as well. Another feature, which is a pro-market feature that I think Australia could adopt to do something about this, is to follow what occurred in the Enterprise Act 2003 in the United Kingdom, and that was to charge the regulators with the responsibility of dealing with complaints that come from groups of either consumers or traders, and to have to investigate them. A super complaint is where a group, in the case of consumers, there was the Which magazine, or the organisation I worked for, Energy Watch, is able to develop a case that argues that there's a feature or features of the market that aren't working in the consumer's interest. And they put that forward together with some evidence to a regulator, and the regulator is bound then to consider in a timely fashion the complaints made and to act on those where there is where they find there to be a market problem. Recently, for example, the consumer magazine Which complained about the charges levied for the use of credit and debit cards. In particular, it could cost, in using some of what appeared to be low-cost airlines in the UK, 30 or 40 extra pounds just to be paying them by credit or debit card, and that had the practice, or had the effect of confusing people as to just what the proper price of those tickets were. The Office of Fair Trading has upheld that super complaint and brought action against a number of the companies on the grounds that that was an abuse of their rights. In the Australian context, many small businesses, many suppliers to supermarkets, dealers with oil companies and others have been very reluctant to bring forward any evidence for fear that the regulator, in this case the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission or ASIC, would not take any action about it. A statutory requirement to do so would change that in a very positive way, in my view. So what's it all about? And if there's a received notion of fairness in the Australian society, there's another received notion that one hears a lot about, and that is the level playing field. And the level playing field isn't about putting particular handicaps on players. It's not a desire to see that vigorous competitors who use innovation and pricing and marketing and customer service to win business should be penalised, but instead to ensure that everybody on that field is allowed to do their best. I recall in speaking about this issue of fairness once to a former minister, Mr. Michael Duffy, who made the comment that in all the years since he's mentioned it, still puzzles me, is that it's all right to have a level playing field, but it has to be level at both ends. And if somebody can work out just what that means, I'd very much like to know. So an agenda then for the Small Business Commissioner at the federal level might be to do some effective advocacy and perhaps to revisit the philosophy of that Queensland Wire decision. And I believe it can be done in this way, that for certainly let us regard competition between corporations who are competing in what I might call a horizontal way, one supermarket with another, or one supermarket with a very large trader, but let's treat it in a different way where the market power is used either in an upstream or a downstream market. And so in November last year, when Coca-Cola and Woolworths had a major stoush, you might recall that Woolworths demanded certain concessions and discounts and supply arrangements with Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola refused. And that for, I think it was 10 weeks, Coca-Cola disappeared from Woolworths stores. And in the end, I don't know what the deal was, but they were able to sort that out. They were two giants fighting it out, and in the end, they came to a commercial arrangement. In the case of smaller businesses, especially tiny suppliers, that's never the outcome. Just before Anzac Day this year, you might recall, or you might not, that the firm Unibiscuit, a firm that makes a good part of a good proportion of Australia's commercial Anzac biscuits, failed, and it went into receivership, and there were complaints about the treatment they received from the major supermarkets. In the end, there was a leveraged buyout, and the production line ran again, and Australia wasn't confronted with the horror of an Anzac Day without biscuits. But it made a point that I think is quite instructive about the way that dealings with big companies can work in one way, but when it comes to small companies, quite different results obtain. And so I believe there's a good case for revisiting the unconscionable conduct laws, which at present can only be used by ordinary consumers. And the courts have made quite a stiff test on that, and that we should find a way of giving access to those remedies for micro and small businesses as well. In my view, that wouldn't damage the vigorous competition that drives markets, drives down prices and drives up quality, but it would mean that behaviour which ordinary people would regard as beyond the pale and not acceptable might be prevented. And that would allow a renewed relationship in that area. There are currently about 8 to 10 industry codes, whether it's on franchising or oil code or supermarkets or quite a few others, that purport to do something about that. But since all of them are based on laws where there's no substantive right to the small business, they all remain pretty ineffectual and don't go anywhere. A simple prohibition on unfair conduct, which was accessible as Section 52 of the Trade Practices Act was to all businesses, would change that in a fairly profound way. I'd like to put those ideas out to this group. I'd like to encourage those who are starting out in a management career and those who are already in them to shape their values by reference to some of those underlying notions of fairness. I think that the human resource literature shows quite clearly that corporations in which leaders practice fairness will get from their staff a greater degree of loyalty and productivity and a striving to help achieve the corporate goals. Those corporations that don't practice fairness tend to get the opposite. They get disloyalty and failure in many other ways. I think that the Australian market now more than ever needs a vibrant small business sector to innovate, to export, to serve consumers, and that at the moment it seems to me that often they're doing that with one hand tied behind their backs, and that the resources that go to complying with government red tape, which everybody would know to be a burden, I think that there's an equal problem in having to assign resources to deal with their dealings with larger corporations, and often that turns out to be quite destructive of the innovation and activities that occur there. And so for my part, I believe that I'm ready, willing and able to work with anybody who wants to bring about a fairer society and a fairer marketplace, but I'm ready, willing and able to work against anybody who doesn't. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allan. And Allan's indicated he's happy to take some questions now from the audience. What I'd like you to do, if you could, is put your hand up, and we've got some roving mics. Then stand up and identify yourself and then ask the question. I'm down here.
Sorry, Maxine. Thank you very much, Bill Pickford, Brookes Club of Stonington, and a person who's practiced his whole life in small business. The biggest problem that I see is that small business is just that, it's small, and it doesn't have the capital resources to pursue avenues that are open to law, and it's so easily hung out to dry by the big corporations, and there's not an equity of opportunity truly in that situation, and I see that prevailing very widely across small business, which I've represented at state level. Would you care to comment?
Well, I would indeed, and that I guess that's partly my point, that we don't want to change the laws in such a way that processes of competition break down and that small businesses don't need to strive. But what we do need to do is to remove some of those barriers that make even wise decision and wise planning futile when faced with decisions by large corporations or government agencies that simply don't care. And that's why I speak about this prohibition on unfair conduct. The Chief Justice of the High Court, Robert French, some years ago spoke about this issue at a conference, and he said the prohibition on misleading and deceptive conduct has become the golden thread of commercial law in Australia, and that one of the benefits of it is that there are no limits. It can be used by small companies or big companies or individuals or government agencies, by consumer groups or anybody to prevent misleading and deceptive conducts. And the courts, after 30 8 years or so now, have a very well settled idea of what constitutes misleading and deceptive conduct, and that it has changed behaviour. In relation, though, to small businesses, they just don't have access to some of these remedies in relation to unfairness or unconscionability. And that we do have in the Australian competition law a whole block of text about franchise arrangements. We have a whole block of text about unconscionable conduct in the unwritten law that picks up the equity notions, but they're just not available, where a simple prohibition that requires fairness in dealings would transform, in my view, that relationship, would cut away the need for small businesses to spend so much time in a defensive posture or hunting to get themselves out of the messes that some very complex contract terms impart. So I think that's a way ahead.
Some other questions? One down here.
Thanks. I'm very sympathetic with your arguments, and just example, insight I see from it. I'm a director of I'm an investment banker of a online life insurance company called Lifebroker. So I'm very aware of this new field of how people are coming to the market, which is not so much now for many people as the supermarket shelves, but it's actually the search engine. So one of the real interesting things now is for all this new commerce is the Google search paradigms have got a very big influence on people's access to market. And do you see, we should be concerned, or the government should be concerned, because Google dominates that, what metrics Google use in allocating rankings?
Well, indeed, and if I could say that for more than 15 years there have been some analogous problems arising. The first big example of that was the airline online booking systems, the computer reservation systems, where a few airlines were able to dominate that, and they gave access to smaller airlines to their computer reservation systems, but with such a biased display that the services offered by the owners of that squeezed out minor players. The banks in the settlement system did the same thing, and that Google, in some of its search algorithms and things, is in many parts of the world under legal challenge for some of that behaviour. For, I guess, 5 or 6 years now, I've been a member of an international group looking to try and reform the laws in interoperability. Put another way, the use of intellectual property rights that become anti-competitive measures. Now, I think we would all instinctively want to see rewards go to innovators for developing new systems and new technology. But when those rewards turn into unjustified profits and to operate at the exclusion of other competitors, then it starts to be a negative in society. And so I think a good competitive market is guaranteed by having open systems, whether it's software systems or systems like that search where you want to know that people aren't able to buy their way into a biased position on search engines. That means that smaller operators are left out. And so I think, again, I don't have an instant solution for that, but Australia is just starting to realise that in the global intellectual property issues, when we signed the agreement with the World Trade Organisation on intellectual property, we gave up huge numbers of rights, and it's going to take us decades to get them back.
Nothing else? I think that's... Oh, one more. We have time for one more question up here.
Thank you, Alan. Doug Robertson, MBA graduate from the early days. I think, like most people here, I'd support your advocacy of a journey to commerce, but I think I'm also concerned about the way in which you use the word fair and how that might end up in courts. And perhaps as an example, from a consumer point of view, you go into a little gift shop and there's a pair of earrings there with a 500% markup, and there's a watch there that's a national watch, and the competition means that the markup's 50. Question is that fair? And how is the notion of fairness going to play out in court?
Well, as it happens, across Australia, there are now more than 20 statutes that do have a fairness test built into them. These go back to the 70s, the Industrial Arbitration Act, 1977 in New South Wales, in relation to dealings with subcontractors. And here in Victoria, there have been fairness laws for a long while as well. And that the courts have shown that it's quite easy if you've got an objective standard, and I mentioned that earlier about where the use of bargaining power by a superior body crushes out the ability of another party to protect their own interests. There are now quite long indicator lists of these things, and that it is true that in the first period there would be a degree of uncertainty. There's no doubt about that. But as with things, so many terms in the law, discrimination, misleading and deceptive conduct, unconscionable conduct, all of those things, the courts have reasonably quickly come to set standards that allow business people, compliance agencies, legal advisors and many others to make good use of that. And so that concern alone, it's a real one and needs to be taken into account, I don't doubt, but it's one that can easily be overcome. And what could be a liberation for hundreds of thousands of small businesses, I think is a price very well worth paying.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. I think we'll need to move on now, and I'd like to invite our Deakin University Vice-Chancellor, Professor Jane Den Hollander, to formally thank you for your Brookes Oration.
Comments, if that's all right. Yes. I've asked you just to say a few comments in response to the speech, Alan, and I thought we could change it from a fair go, a journey to fairness in commerce, to a fair go, a journey to fairness in education. And I was reflecting that your comments around competition and large corporations, and of course a university is a very large corporation. We have 43,000 consumers today, and then 6,500 staff. But of course we're not that. What we are is a body of very small businesses, usually called schools, and there are heads of schools in the room who compete mightily with the large corporation, which is the university. And it's interesting that is often at that small coalface between our schools, where the discipline is, where students always identify and belong, that all the action happens. And I wanted to comment on a couple of things. And the questions I would put, and this is rhetorical, we don't need answers now, about fairness and the level playing field. And I'll give you two examples of how we see it playing out in an environment where increasingly the private purse now pays for education. The vast majority of our students pay a significant amount of money, be they Australian taxpayers or indeed international guests who add to our diversity and the richness of what we have. But if we take access to university these days, how do you compare a young person from a privileged background at an elite school in Melbourne with a young person from a very small school in a socially disadvantaged area of anywhere in Australia, or indeed a small rural school where the town is down to 40 people? How do you compare their access, and is it a level playing field? And should we think about that again? The university, of course, is under pressure of competition and the media to always take those of the highest ATARs, and we know that we, mostly the people in this room, that our children will get those high ATARs. But what about the level playing field and those many Australians? And then the other part of fairness, I think, is around exams and our increasing place. And this weekend, I understand that the Prime Minister will have her paper on Australia's role in the Asian century. And I reflect often that fairness is often about things that depend on your culture, and where you come from. So, for example, in this country, plagiarism is something where you don't cut and paste, that you do understand that you must give your opinion. There are many societies in this world where it is a sign of respect to your elders and the masters that you faithfully repeat what they have told you. And we call that cheating here. So how do we make sure that the level playing field and that the information that we give to our students particularly, or to anyone in our society, that they understand what the playing field is? So, ladies and gentlemen, since 2006, this Brookes Oration has contributed to debate on a wide range of issues, and importantly has built links on how these issues resonate with academe, with the public and with business. And tonight we have had a great oration from a very interesting and highly educated man. And I'll end with these words for you, Allan, is that in universities we often say that data is not information, and information is not knowledge, and knowledge of its own is not wisdom. Tonight we had data that became information, that became knowledge, and we had a very wise talk from someone who is across his field, and if you could see his notes here, you would be horrified. I was quite stricken when we sat down that the notes that Allan was going to use were going to somehow evolve into a talk of more than 5 minutes. And ladies and gentlemen, we have been honoured tonight, and on all of your behalves, but most particularly on behalf of the Brookes family and of course Deakin University, who is named after their antecedents, that we tonight honour a great speaker. Thank you very much. And I
challenges on those education issues.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure you could join us. I think for someone in this next stage of your life, is universities would be a happy hunting ground for an ombudsman. But I'll calm everyone down and tell you that we're completely compliant on all issues. Mr. Allan Asher, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
I think he just wants a picture.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Not just have one picture.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
There we are.
Lovely. Good. Looking back to the big smile. Lovely.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much,
Thank
Allan.
you.
It was lovely. And we'll both take, I'll take my iPad and Allan will take it.
Thank you very much, Allan, and thank you very much, Jane. The concept of schools being small businesses and the university being a big business, and fairness, I'm going to have to return to that one, I think. I will remember that. So, the next part of our function this evening involves the presentation of the 2011 Brookes Scholars, an award that was established through the active involvement of Sir Wilfred Brookes. Each year since 1985, the university has awarded the Brookes Medal to the top 2 graduating MBA students as determined by their grades across the whole degree. I'd like to invite Mr. Andrew Brookes onto the stage to present the awards to this year's winners, selected as the top 2 graduates from the whole 2011 MBA graduating group. I'm delighted to announce that the winners of the 2011 Brookes Scholars Awards are Ms. Janine Reid and Mr. Timothy Pride. I invite Mr. Reid and Ms. Reid and Pride to join us on stage. We need to get you up here so we can see you both, you see. So. Our first winner, Janine Reid, completed a Bachelor of Laws in 1994. She was admitted as a solicitor in 1996 and has worked in law firms and insurance firms between 1996 and 2000. She joined WorkCover in Queensland in 2000 and has held several positions within this organisation, leading to her current role as Regional Manager. In this position, Janine is responsible for 120 staff who manage injury and workers' compensation claims for manufacturing and tourism industry employees in Queensland. This represents over $300 million in claims expenditure. Janine is married to Dennis Fitzgerald and they share a love of sport and travelling. Janine tells me that her last big trip was in Egypt and Morocco, and that she recalled sailing down the Nile while reading her economics textbook for the MBA class. She didn't mention just what Dennis said about this at the time, but I can probably guess. Despite the distraction of the Pharaohs and work requirements, Janine has achieved distinctions or high distinctions for all of her MBA subjects. Ms. Janine Reid, on behalf of the Deakin Graduate School of Business And Mr. Brookes, I'd like to congratulate you on your achievements, and Mr. Brookes will present you with a certificate and the 2011 Brookes Medal.
Thank you.
Okay. Our second recipient of the Brookes Medal is Mr. Tim Pride. Tim graduated in 1997 with a Bachelor of Commerce and a Bachelor of Engineering with first-class honours. He then worked for several years with Unilever in engineering, marketing and supply chain roles before moving into the not-for-profit sector with Interserve Australia. With this organisation, he spent 4 years as National Operations Manager for a development organisation in Kyrgyzstan. And I had to practice saying that too. I actually now know what the capital is. Bishkek, so I'm doing well. Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, where he commenced his Deakin MBA. He continued his studies through his next placement of 3 years' duration, coordinating international communications for Interserve across more than 50 countries based in Malaysia. Returning to Australia in 2010 with his wife Emily and 2 young children, he completed his MBA studies and with his brother established FlexiFoot Australia, the local distributor of an innovative walking aid product. With this business now established and resourced, he has recently started working with Daniels Corporation International as their supply chain supervisor. Tim's excellent results in his MBA, despite undertaking the subjects in some very remote locations in many different countries, is testament to both his hard work and dedication, but also to the study flexibility provided by Deakin's MBA. Despite Tim's far-flung job responsibilities, he has also received nothing but distinctions and high distinctions throughout his MBA degree. Mr. Timothy Pride, on behalf of the Deakin Graduate School of Business, and Mr. Brookes, I'd like to congratulate you on your achievements, and Mr. Brookes will present you with your certificate. Fantastic. I think our 2 Brookes medalists represent the many and varied backgrounds and work responsibilities of our Deakin MBA candidates, who really appreciate the flexibility of study options available through our degree programs. Please join me again in congratulating both Janine and Tim on their outstanding achievements. Before closing tonight's events, you have to suffer the advertisements, I'm sorry, but I want to remind you about some of the many great things we're doing with our alumni in the MBA. Firstly, we are continuing our regular professional development series designed to update your knowledge on relevant themes. The next scheduled event will be a breakfast meeting on the 6th of December at the Deakin University Melbourne City Centre in Bourke Street. The guest speaker at that event will be the Commissioner John Lewin of Fair Work Australia. And Fair Work Australia, as you would know, has achieved some headlines recently over a number of issues. So John Lewin will be speaking at that event on the 6th of December. Also a reminder that our school provides an accessible online networking and career development service, which is available to all current MBA students and all alumni that can assist in developing your networks and increasing your employment opportunities. From November 5, just in a couple of weeks' time, we're running our week-long 2012 WOFI event. WOFI, an acronym standing for Workshop for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. This year, we're focusing on providing innovative solutions to the charitable and not-for-profit sector. The idea is we get groups of our postgraduate students from all across the university, many different faculties, and we invite charities or not-for-profits to provide challenges. Then we spend a week with those students, giving them expert knowledge from outside speakers and from some of our academics, and they work in a team on providing a solution to the issue provided by that not-for-profit, whether it's for finding new members, finding new ways of funding, or other situations they're facing. The students spend a full week working on that. They present at the end to a group of judges, and there's some prize money involved. but the learning on both sides is wonderful. We ran it last year and the students are still talking about it. The companies are still getting the students out there from those groups to present to their teams. So it's a great way of interacting with our community, and this year we're focusing on the not-for-profit sector. In 2012, we also invited our alumni in class initiative. We also initiated our alumni in class, where we're inviting alumni to join one of our core subject classes each trimester to provide our current students with an overview of how the subject relates to the real world of business. We have appointed an alumni coordinator who will be overseeing the development of new initiatives and improved interaction with our growing alumni base. We regard our alumni as a key part of what we do, and we want to keep touch with them. With over 30 years of graduations from MBA, we have a growing number of alumni, and we want to try and make sure that we keep contact with those people and keep them involved in what we're doing. I encourage all of our alumni to get involved in these events. They represent a great way to update your knowledge and stay in touch with your fellow graduates and Deakin staff members. So our 2012 Brookes Oration draws to a close. I'd like to thank Allan Asher for his valuable time and excellent presentation tonight, and both Roger and Andrew Brooks for their patronage and assistance. Thanks also to Laura K. Smith and Samantha Hine for the event planning and coordination, and to Cynthia Johnson and Vicky Daly for their assistance tonight and leading up to the event. And finally, thank you to all of you for attending the event. I hope you've enjoyed the evening, and I wish you a safe journey home. Thank you very much.